Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 1, The Dusk of Hapsburg. If for a space we obliterate from our minds the fighting in France and Flanders, the struggle upon the Eastern Front is incomparably the greatest war in history. In its scale, in its slaughter, in the exertions of the combatants, in its military kaleidoscope, it far surpasses by magnitude and intensity all similar human episodes. It is also the most mournful conflict of which there is record. All three empires, both sides, victors and vanquished, were ruined. All the emperors or their successors were slain or deposed. The houses of Romanov, Habsburg and Hohenzollern, woven over centuries of renown into the texture of Europe, were shattered and extirpated. The structure of three mighty organisms built up by generations of patience and valor, and representing the traditional groupings of noble branches of the European family, was changed beyond all semblance. These pages recount dazzling victories and defeats stoutly made good. They record the toils, perils, sufferings and passions of millions of men. Their sweat, their tears, their blood bedewed the endless plain. 10 million homes awaited the return of the warriors. 100 cities prepared to acclaim their triumphs. But all were defeated, all were stricken. Everything that they had given was given in vain. The hideous injuries they inflicted and bore, the privations they endured, the grand loyalties they exemplified, all were in vain. Nothing was gained by any. They floundered in the mud, they perished in the snowdrifts, they starved in the frost. Those that survived, the veterans of countless battle days, returned, whether with the laurels of victory or tidings of disaster, to homes engulfed already in catastrophe. We may make our pictures of this front from Napoleon's campaigns. Hard and somber war, war of winter, bleak and barren regions, long marches forward and back again under heavy burdens, horses dying in the traces, wounded frozen in their own blood, the dead uncounted, unburied, the living pressed again into the mill. Eylau, Aspern, Wagram, Borodino, the Beresina. All the sinister impressions of these names revive, divested of their vivid flash of pomp and enlarged to a hideous size. Here all Central Europe tore itself to pieces and expired in agony, to rise again unrecognizable. In earlier volumes I have traced the remorseless growth of those antagonisms, which in the last quarter of the 19th century converted Europe into an armed camp, and into two great systems of alliances upon whose equipoise the peace of the world was uncertainly founded. But this long process was studied and described primarily from the standpoint of the Western powers, and centered upon the abiding quarrel between France and Germany and the attitude of Great Britain thereto. We now reascend the streams of history to those sources of the World War which arose in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Even if Germany and France had never been rivals and enemies, or if England had never been estranged by Germany, the fountainheads of wrath in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Balkan states would sooner or later have overflowed in a deluge of water. Without these eastern sources of trouble, the mighty Western powers might have long dwelled in the sunshine of peace and progress. It was the fatal confluence of two powerful, separate, and self-moving sets of antagonisms that alone rendered possible the supreme catastrophe, and it was the course of events in the East that fixed the fatal hour. The states and peoples of Central and Southeastern Europe lay upon its broad expanses in the confusion left from ancient wars. The old battlefields were cumbered with the bones of bygone warriors, and the flags and trophies of far-off victories, and over them brooded the memories of many a cruel oppression and many a perished cause. In the main, the empire of the Habsburgs and the states of the Balkan Peninsula sate amid the ruins of centuries of struggle with the invading, proselytizing, devastating Turk. Here, long after they had ebbed and ceased in the West, the tides of warlike Islam had finally been dammed. After long-drawn struggles, the Danube was liberated. For a while the Ottoman power reigned over the Christian races of the Balkans, and even in its decrepitude held them in a withering grip. One by one, aided mainly by Russia, these fierce races, hammered hard upon the anvil of Turkish misrule, shook themselves free, until finally the Turkish power was broken forever. Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece, relieved from the curse of bondage for 500 years, stood erect and gazed upon each other almost immediately with eyes of keen malevolence and rivalry. Each of them remembered that at one time or another the hegemony of the Balkans had been hers, and all began to gather up the tangled, severed threads of their conflicting national histories. First among the champions of Christendom stood the empire of the Tsars. If Austrian and Hungarian chivalry had stemmed the Turkish invasion, it was Russia who for 2 centuries had advanced upon Turkey, inspired to the deliverance of kindred races still in bondage, and impelled by other motives towards Constantinople and the warm open waters of the Mediterranean. The feud between Russia and Turkey was as old and as deadly as that between France and Germany. But whereas Russia, animated by Peter and Catherine and other famous Romanov sovereigns, had waxed continually, the Ottoman power had waned and set. From the 14th to the 18th century, the peril and preoccupation of Central and Eastern Europe was Turkish strength. During the 19th, its danger was Turkish weakness. The final retreat of invading armies, the freeing of virile races and wide domains, the decay and disappearance of a common foe, gradually relaxed or destroyed the bonds which had long united the races of the dual monarchy. The necessities which had induced the Teutons, Czechs, Magyars, and Slavs to form a joint empire for security had stood the strain of a succession of disastrous wars and civil wars. As the external enemy faded and died, the army of the Austro-Hungarian Empire began to fall to pieces. Like the liberated states of the Balkans, the 4 constituent peoples of the Danubian plains began to think again for themselves about their past and their future. Hungary had, in revolt and revolution, almost torn herself away in 1848. Caught and crushed by Russian armies pouring through the passes of the Carpathians, she was led back captive by the Tsar and chained once more to the throne of his brother emperor. It was upon an orgy of blood and executions that the youthful Francis Joseph entered upon his long and fatal reign. Bohemia, in the general resurgence of nationalism which marked the close of the 19th century, fretted, chafed, and struggled in the Austrian net. Perhaps she might have been reconciled if the duel had become a triple crown. But this neither Francis Joseph nor Hungary would concede. To the southward the problem of the empire were even more acute. The southern Slavs lay astride the imperial frontiers. The core of the race was in Serbia, but large numbers of Slavonic folk dwelt north of the Danube and in the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The sentiment and tradition of all the southern Slavs turned towards Serbia as to a magnet, and through Serbia far back across the ages to the once great Serb empire of Stefan Dušan. To revivify those glories and reunite the lands and peoples, now sundered, became the persisting ambition of the Serbian people from the moment they had shaken off the Turkish yoke. This hardy, warlike stock, the Prussians of the Balkans, whose teeth were whetted in centuries of unrecorded ferocious struggles with the Sultan's troops, respected nothing that stood in their way. Reckless of consequences to themselves or others, fearing naught and enduring all, they pursued their immense design through the terrors and miseries of Armageddon, and have in fact achieved their purpose at its close. All these disruptive forces were actively and increasingly at work within the empire in the latter part of the last century. The progress of the Western world, the advance of democratic ideas, the imperative necessity for universal education, the adoption of representative and parliamentary institutions upon a wide franchise, the requirements of compulsory military service, all tended to aggravate the stresses. So long as education was a privilege gained with difficulty by the ardent few, questions of language and history were not disturbing. But when mixed populations and mingled religions took their obligatory seats in millions at the desks, every classroom, every curriculum in every village school became an arena. There was not in the declining empire any force equal to that which has imposed throughout all innumerable national schools of the United States one single language and one universal secularism. Each race in the dual monarchy indulged its separatist tendencies to the full, and reviving ancient, even long-forgotten tongues, used these as weapons in ever-extending hostilities. Vain to assemble such contrary elements in an empire parliament house. Vain to suppose that the processes and amenities of English House of Commons procedure would afford expression to such bitter divergencies. Parliaments can only flourish when fundamentals are agreed or at least accepted by the great majority of all parties. In the parliaments of the Habsburgs, bands of excited deputies sat and howled at each other by the hour in rival languages, accompanying their choruses with the ceaseless slamming of desks, which eventually by a sudden crescendo swelled into a cannonade. All gave rein to hatred, and all have paid for its indulgence with blood and tears. These racial manifestations and their allied, though not coincident socialist and proletarian tendencies were viewed with gnawing anxiety by the cultured, privileged, land-owning aristocracy, by the numerous hierarchies of officials, and by the military classes upon whom the defense of property, the cohesion of the empire, and the maintenance of the monarchy depended. 3 or 4 Irelands, at once Sinn Féin and socialistic, brawled together and wrenched at the structure of the empire, while the powerful governing classes, whose safety and prosperity were wrapped in its survival, watched the scene with wrath, fear, and perplexity. Thus the 20th century dawned upon the 60 million persons over whom the weary, stricken, tragic, octogenarian heir of the ages and their curses continued for a space to reign. The spectacle of Turkish decrepitude, of Balkan ambitions and Austrian decay would not be complete without the Polish dream. While along the Danube the centrifugal forces gathered momentum, the centripetal preserved an undying energy on both sides of the Vistula. Here lay the famous kingdom of Poland, for 130 years partitioned between the 3 military empires which surrounded it, but treasuring always the hope of freedom and reunion, and capable of shaking to their very vitals every one of its 3 devourers. Deep hidden in the vaults of Warsaw reposed the old banners of the Polish nation. Helpless in the talons of the 3 imperial eagles, closely woven into the texture of the 3 proud armies, liable at any moment to be marched against each other in compulsory fratricidal strife, 20 or 30 million Poles awaited the day when, amid the ruins of empires, their hidden flags would once again salute the daylight. Here too was a dream which has not failed. The creaking and straining system of the dual monarchy revolved ponderously around the person of the aged emperor. Francis Joseph had ascended his throne in 1848 amid executions, martial law, and the rigorous suppression of revolt. He had sustained every kind of public tribulation and domestic tragedy. His brother, the Emperor Maximilian, had been executed in Mexico by a rebel firing party. His only son, Rudolf, heir to the throne, had perished tragically in 1889. His wife had been stabbed through the heart on a jetty at Geneva by an Italian anarchist. He had never declared a foreign war he did not lose, nor bent himself to a domestic policy which was not evidently failing. In 1859, the fields of Solferino and Magenta had stripped him of North Italy. In 1866, the Battle of Sadova had transferred the hegemony of Germany from Austria to Prussia. Hungary, against whom he had warred with severity, asserted a challenging separatism in the heart of the empire. Bohemia, whom he would never recognize as a partner, chafed bitterly under his hands. However, he lived and thrived. He had sat on the throne for more than 60 years when King Edward VII died. At 75, he was not only well preserved, but vigorous. He walked far. He could still ride. His chief amusement was shooting boar and bears and deer. He had borne his bereavements stoically. He was jealous of his brother Maximilian. He did not love his wife. He had been on bad terms with all his family, some of whom had incurred a public notoriety which by his rigid standards was beyond any pardon. He politely acquiesced in the existence of his nephew, the new heir, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but he could never forgive him for his love marriage. General Marchenko, Russian military attaché at Vienna from 1905 to 1911, in memoirs which are a definite contribution to history, says that a colleague, Major von Bülow, the German attaché, brother of the German ex-chancellor and afterwards killed in Belgium, remarked upon the emperor's troubles, "He is used to all that. Without a misfortune in the day's work he would be bored." Marchenko himself says that Francis Joseph regarded his defeats and reverses as sacrifices to fortune. A courtly, sagacious, crabbed, disillusioned old gentleman, reared in the purple, harassed from youth up by awful public responsibilities, with an ever-present self-questioning about their adequate discharge. In the closing phase of his reign, he had become almost an automaton. He discharged routine duties without pleasure, indeed with distaste, punctually and assiduously, literally from dawn to dusk. He rose usually at 4 in the morning and dressed in his sky-blue uniform, drank his coffee at the desk amid official portfolios and files. His wish was to go to sleep not later than 8 o'clock at night. He resented keenly all functions which interrupted this rule. When compelled to entertain company, he dined as late as 5 or even 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Otherwise, although in Vienna the usual hour was between 8 and 9 o'clock, the emperor took his evening meal between 3 and 4. Alone, upon his rocky pinnacle from which the tides of time had sunk, this venerable, conscientious functionary continued in harness, pulling faithfully at the collar, mostly in the right direction, to the last gasp. A living picture of the court is given by Baron von Margutti, who was for the last 17 years of the empire high in the household. Francis Joseph lived in intimacy with a curious small coterie consisting of 2 septuagenarian aides-de-camp, Count Paar and Baron Wolfras, who was also chief of the military cabinet, and Count Beck, 70 years of age in 1906, and perhaps the emperor's one trusted male friend. All these 3 men stood around the center of power. They had dwelt there before most of Francis Joseph's subjects had been born. Their lives were wrapped up in the service of the emperor. Pa, ably served by younger men, dealt with all the questions, great and small, of etiquette and a large part of patronage. Bolfras presided over the court side of the military sphere, but he brooded over higher matters of policy, had constant occasions to give his advice, and indeed claims to have both counselled and planned, in 1878, the original occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Beck, who had served the emperor for 50 years in 1906, managed and looked after all the movements and public appearances of his beloved master. He knew exactly how he liked reviews, maneuvers, inspections of camps or garrisons, and every non-political public activity to be conducted. He studied the imperial wants and idiosyncrasies. He protected his sovereign from every kind of minor annoyance. He also, no doubt, supplied him with a stream of antiquated opinion upon military matters, for he had been, in his day, chief of the staff of the Austro-Hungarian army. Such was this ancient band of survivors, eminently Victorian, unswervingly faithful, who surrounded the very old but clear-headed potentate, in whose person all the loyalties of a disrupting empire centered, and against whose regime all its hatreds welled. The emperor had one other confidant. Katharina Schrath, the daughter of a postmaster in Baden, near Vienna, had been in the 80s a successful actress. Francis Joseph admired her beauty, charm, and humor. The empress welcomed her. She became associated with the court. For over 30 years she was the emperor's cherished friend. Whether at Schönbrunn or Ischl, her discreet dwelling was always close at hand. Very early in the mornings, the old gentleman would leave his palace by a private door, and walking by carefully secluded paths, would breakfast with Frau Schrath, always good-tempered and smiling, in an old-fashioned room with a white-clothed table, gay with flowers. Here he found peace, happiness, and a window on the world, which none of his punctually handled portfolios would have given him. Frau von Schrath, as she came to be called, was extremely well informed upon all kinds of public and social matters. Ministers, bankers, nobles, and actors found it both wise and agreeable to keep in touch with her. She was, says Chupik, the link between the emperor and the outer world. She was his newspaper. From her he learned more than from all his ministers put together. It was often only from her that he learned the truth. Indeed, on the tragic morning when the suicide or murder of the emperor's only son had to be announced to him, it was Frau von Schrath that the Empress Elisabeth turned, and the two women went together to break the news. This gifted woman, who had within limits the power to make and mar, remained always a private figure. She never abused her position to amass a fortune or aggrandize herself. She spoke to the emperor on matters of state with tact and modesty, but she knew how to tell him what she believed was for his good, and he was always ready to listen and ponder on all she said. Her influence was jealously resented by the court chamberlain, the Count of Monte Nuovo, the guardian of etiquette and correctitude. He labored continually to disturb the relationship between her and his imperial master, but he labored without success. This companionship was Francis Joseph's only happiness. He held tenaciously to it to the end. It remains to be said that the emperor, of course, was a strong conservative. He thought that old-fashioned habits and methods and a conservative outlook were enjoined upon him by his position and by the complicated texture of his empire. He did not conceal his abhorrence of innovation. He would never use a lift, avowed dislike for electrical appliances, detested the telephone, only rode in a motor car to please King Edward, and disapproved of flying. All we can say with our superior knowledge is that in these unfashionable opinions he has not yet been proved wrong. The death of the Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889 transferred the succession to the Emperor's brother Charles, and on the latter's death in 1896 it passed to his eldest son, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand. The heir apparent had the advantage of being educated without any expectation of the throne. He was a fine-looking man of moderate ability, simple tastes, tactless manners, a sincere character, and a strong will. From his maternal grandfather, the Bomb King of Sicily, he inherited a distrust of strangers and a tendency to believe himself disliked. It is said of him that he once remarked to his chief of staff, "You generally expect that every man will prove an angel. For my part, I always assume that anyone I see for the first time is a scoundrel, and later on, if possible, I revise my opinion." At the castle of the Archduke Frederick at Pressburg, he was a welcome guest, because it was hoped he might marry the eldest daughter princess. However, it was gradually suspected that his interests was engaged by a young maid of honor, a German Czech lady of honorable but not elevated parentage, Countess Chotek. Cross-questioned by her mistress, the Archduchess Isabella, the Countess Chotek disposed of these rumors by a complete denial. But one day during a holiday by the Adriatic, the Archduchess picked up by chance a locket dropped unwittingly by its owner. She opened the locket and found therein a miniature of Franz Ferdinand with the inscription, "Thine forever." She recognized the locket as usually worn by the Countess Chotek. No time was lost in dismissing the maid of honor. The sequel startled the Austrian world. Franz Ferdinand, considering that he had compromised a young lady and involved her in disgrace and dismissal, gave full rein to the passion of his life. He announced at once that he would marry her. The old emperor, who had planned to wed his new heir to the widow of his son Rudolf, the Crown Princess Stephanie, was deeply shocked. Vienna was thrilled, and the dual monarchy agog. A score of obstacles, arguments, and vetoes were interposed. Franz Ferdinand crashed through them all. He signed an act of renunciation of any right to the throne for his future wife and children. He was ready to renounce it for himself, if need be. The marriage took place. This was the greatest, the happiest, and the grandest event of his life. They were a devoted couple, inseparable in life and death. However, persistent and renewing complications disturbed the rigid etiquette of the imperial court. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a figure of the highest importance, and as the emperor aged, he was bound to play an ever-increasing and almost dominant part in the politics and military affairs of the empire. There was one key which always unlocked his regard. The ceremonial treatment accorded to his wife was for him decisive. She was by Hungarian law, whose generous principles considered only the fact of marriage, bound to become Queen of Hungary on her husband's accession to the empire. In Austria, however, her precedence was lowly, and kept lowly, and embarrassing situations arose at every public function at which both sexes were present. With the birth of his children, the Archduke found a new incentive. He looked back with remorse upon his oath of renunciation of their rights. Ease would retract vows made in pain, as violent and void. To procure for his loved ones the recognition which he deemed their due became the paramount object of his life. The Countess Chotek fanned his flame incessantly. The woman's ambition, said the suffragan bishop of Vienna to Margutti, is unbridled, and her unusual intelligence will soon show her the way to translate it into actual fact. The Kaiser Wilhelm, footnote, for convenience, in this account Francis Joseph is always referred to as the Emperor, and William II as the Kaiser. End of footnote. The Kaiser William was not slow to pick up the obvious key and fit it in the all-important lock. Before his marriage, Franz Ferdinand was antagonistic to the Germans, hated the Kaiser, and spoke of him with even more than his usual candor. But William II took pains. Whenever he passed through Vienna, it was to the Countess Chotek that he paid special attention. Friendship was soon established. Franz Ferdinand and his wife, invited to Berlin, were entertained with every possible honor. At the banquet, the adoption of small round tables enabled the Kaiser to place the Countess at his side without departing from the rules. Compliments and courtesies were unceasing. The Countess Chotek, who was a charming woman, amiable, capable, and discreet, became a German partisan. She spoke of the Kaiser in terms of the highest regard and admiration. She had no difficulty in carrying her husband with her. He discarded his former prejudices, and from 1908 or 1909 onwards, the two men were close friends. The old emperor continued to disapprove the marriage, but as the weight of years descended upon him, resigned himself to events. Meanwhile, the charge of the imperial army and the navy developed upon the heir apparent, and in spite of the prejudices and resistances of Francis Joseph and his ancient military cabinet, very considerable reforms were introduced into the army, especially in the artillery, and it was gradually Germanized and furnished with new weapons and young leaders. Foremost among these new chiefs stood, to give him for the first and last time his full title, General of Infantry Franz Freiherr Konrad von Hötzendorf. In 1914 his name was scarcely known outside his own country. Even during the conflict, his repute did not extend outside purely military circles. The large agitated publics who devoured the war news in France, England, or America never heard of him. Nevertheless, he played a greater part in the World War and in its origins than any other of the 60 million subjects of the Habsburg Empire. He was in fact the commander of all their armies during the greater part of the war. He made the plans. He conducted the mobilization and fought almost all the battles. He went beyond these important duties. He was a diplomat as well as a soldier, a politician as well as a strategist. Indeed, it is said by those who knew him that he was a politician first and a soldier second. He represented that most dangerous of combinations, a chief of the general staff absorbed in foreign policy. What Ludendorff became in 1917, Konrad was already some 10 years earlier. Born in 1852, the son of a colonel of hussars, Konrad mounted steadily the grades of the Austrian army. As a lecturer and a writer upon tactics and military training, he was one of those apostles of the offensive for whom machine guns and barbed wire had prepared so many disillusions. In 1906, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand entrusted him with the reorganization of the imperial armies and marked him out for the first military position both in peace and war. Konrad was inspired in his duties by an intense realization of the dire and increasing peril of the empire. He saw it wrecked at home by racial stresses and surrounded by fierce, powerful, and hungry foreign foes. Russia, Italy, Romania, and above all Serbia seemed to him enemies who waited but for the chance to fall upon the dying empire and carve their fortunes from its body. Russia coveted Galicia, Romania aimed at Transylvania, Italy sought the redemption of the Tyrol and the Adriatic coast, while Serbia, aspiring to found with Russian sympathy a great kingdom for the southern Slavs, seemed to Konrad the most malignant and hateful of all. It cannot be denied that when the time came, all these countries proved themselves mortal enemies of the Austrian Empire, nor that they all invaded or threatened the provinces on which their hearts were set. nor that 3 out of the 4 have gained their objects in the main, if not to the full. Studying these strategic problems as a soldier, Conrad convinced himself that if all his country's enemies combined, ruin was certain. He wished, therefore, to fight them one by one. We must, he said, take the first opportunity of reckoning with our most vulnerable enemy, lest our foes deliver a blow. He was for knocking out each enemy as occasion arose, so as to be sure that they would not all set upon Austria simultaneously. He believed in preventive wars and was convinced Austria could fight 2 or 3 in succession, first Italy, then Serbia, and so on. For nearly 10 years he laid siege to the emperor. His persistency often offended his master, and his sincerity and ability won him renewed opportunities to offend. In the end he had his way. Constant dropping wears away stone. His power of work surpassed his physical strength. Accustomed to mountain air from long service in Tyrol, he felt stifled in his room in the Ministry of War. In the frosts of winter he worked with his windows open, and his visitors caught cold. He was stern with himself, that he might be more stern with others. He courted toil and privation, and inflicted them readily upon his troops. Indeed, at the maneuvers a year before the war, he pressed the army so hard that the Archduke was forced to remonstrate. "It is not necessary," said Franz Ferdinand, "to teach the soldiers to die in time of peace." This dark, small, frail, thin officer, with piercing and expressive eyes, set in the face of an ascetic, austere in his way of living, fearless of men and events, devoted to his profession and to the emperor, consumed with anxiety for his country, dwelt year after year at the very center of Europe's powder magazine in special charge of the detonators. The alliance which Bismarck had formed in 1879 between Germany and Austria had broadened into a triple alliance by including Italy in 1883. But the Reassurance Treaty of 1887 between Germany and Russia freed this formidable grouping from any offensive character. It was not until Bismarck had gone that the growth of pan-Slav feeling in Russia and the unwisdom of German policy produced the rift between Russia and Germany, which led eventually to the abyss. From 1892, when the Russo-French alliance was declared, Europe was divided in a new sense between a triple and a dual combination. The Anglo-French Agreement of 1904 not only ended the quarrels between Great Britain and France, but drew us in consequence closer to Russia. The gradual association of Great Britain with these two countries weakened the ties which joined Italy to the Triple Alliance. In neither case was there any overt or formal change. British ministers still proclaimed the detachment of the British Empire from European combinations, and Italian statesmen reaffirmed their loyalty to the Triple Alliance. Nevertheless, there had been a double simultaneous alteration in the European balance. The dawn of the sinister 20th century revealed a distinct confrontation of Germany and Austria by France and Russia. Between these two pairs there were deep-seated antagonisms. Henceforward the clash of Russian and Austrian interests in the Balkans flowed along the same channel as the ancient unending quarrel between Germany and France. The sun still shone brightly and the weather was fair, but there was a sharp chill in the breeze. The war between Russia and Japan cut across the rival groupings. At first, the failure of the Russians and the British association with Japan seemed to weaken the dual alliance to an almost fatal extent. But the ever-rising power and assertiveness of Germany and the disputes about Morocco drew the nations back to their main alignments. France and Germany had during the last quarter of the 19th century acquired impressive colonial possessions. England had conquered and annexed the Boer republics. All these three powers were actively establishing themselves along the North African shore, from Egypt to Morocco. The French had waived their rights and interests in Egypt in consideration of British support in Morocco. But Germany, not consulted in the Anglo-French Convention, resisted fiercely the satisfaction of French claims in Morocco. The apparition of England at the Algeciras Conference and her skillful intervention had left Germany isolated with Austria as her sole ally and supporter. Efforts for peace and international agreement were not lacking, but neither the Hague Conference of 1907 nor its predecessor of 1899 were really peace conferences at all. Their contribution to the maintenance of peace, apart perhaps from the establishment of the Hague Court, was almost negligible. They occupied themselves mainly with the rules of war, and even here they were not successful in devising codes that could stand the test of reality. This engrossing concentration on particular aspects of war set every general staff thinking, and fomented much suspicion. No small part of our own preparations at the Committee of Imperial Defense had their origin in the ambiguities of the Hague Conventions, which compelled us to decide what our own policy should be and opened up vistas of fields still unexplored in the work of war preparation. These remorseless developments, which nothing in the organization of the Old World could control, added to the burden which Germany already bore through her own expansion and ambitions. All the insoluble problems and obscure stresses of the decaying Austro-Hungarian Empire. From this time onwards, the two Central Empires made common cause, and each became perforce the undiscriminating champion of the other's aims. They had been allied, they were now combined. They were now shackled. Austria, vaunting her fidelity, looked to the might of Germany as her means of life, and Germany, with the best and strongest army in the world, knew that Austria was her only friend. This vicious, fatal degeneration made the peace and civilization of mankind dependent upon the processes of disintegration and spasms of recovery which alternately racked the Habsburg monarchy. The quarrel about Alsace-Lorraine was reopened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The naval antagonism between Great Britain and Germany was fomented by the passions of races who had never seen the sea. The glory and safety of Europe hung henceforth upon its weakest link.